do some other introductions, and then also introduce the author herself. And I will hand it off to you.
Thank you very much. I forgot I'm supposed to do this. I'm wearing my tennis jacket from high school. That's 59 years ago. So I feel a little old, but it's good to be old if you're involved with the Historical Society. This society has been around since 1963. So it's been a long, long time. And we have an archive that we're trying to scan. We're always looking for volunteers. We've been closed since December, but I just saw on our email we're going to open up May 30th or 31st, something like that. 30th. So hopefully they'll have a lot of food or an ice cream social to celebrate that, so you can come. So we welcome you. Thank you for coming on a Saturday. Nice day outside, but you decided to come here to listen to this talk. And Karin, I'll let you self-introduce. How about that?
Oh, okay. Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for this warm welcome. I am so honored to be here among distinguished Chinese American historians and all of you working to preserve the Chinese American experience, because that's really important to me as well, and a big motivation for why I wrote the book. I wrote this book. I'm also a writer for the Alameda Post. I've written for Newsbreak and Asian News in the past, and this is actually my third incarnation. I think in college I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I just loved words and I loved literature, but trying to tell your blue-collar immigrant parents that you want to be a writer is kind of like saying you want to be a ballerina or an actress. My mom wanted me to do something much more practical. So I did a couple of decades of professional work, and then I was a dance instructor when my girls were young, and finally during the pandemic I got to become a writer. So I feel very blessed that in the autumn of my life I get to follow my dreams and what I would like to do. So let's begin. I wonder if we could have the lights lower so that, yeah, thank you. What I'd like to do is talk about why I wrote The Strength of Water, a bit about the title, and then my theme today is Thriving in the Margins, History from a Chinese American Woman's Perspective. If there's time, I will talk about getting to visit my family's ancestral village in China, which was a special experience, and a Q&A. So why did I write this? Throughout my childhood, my mother told me stories. Stories about growing up in her father's Chinese laundry business during the infancy of the automobile industry in Detroit, and later in a Cantonese village on the eve of and during the Sino-Japanese War. She also spoke of what it was like to survive as a young woman in mid-century California as a domestic worker and a waitress.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do you mind just standing? Yes, sorry about this.
Oh, is this good?
Yes, it's all good.
Okay. And there were tales Dickensian in their pathos of those who take advantage of the poor, of family addictions, painful racism, wartime privations, the perils of marrying too young and then feeling trapped in marriage by social pressures. But there were also stories about the strength of family, the kindness of strangers, and the power, as she put it, of fighting for your little slice of happiness in this world before you pass on. Those were her words, fighting for my little slice of happiness. And along the way, she revealed history from fascinating perspectives, from a woman's perspective, from an immigrant family's, and from a life on the margins. For me, the stories felt mythological. I grew up here in the San Francisco Bay Area, across the bay in Piedmont, in a modest 2-bedroom house, but next to a mansion so large that it extended from one street to the next, so that I felt like Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. And how did this happen in a single generation when my mother had not even had the chance to finish high school? So that's what I wanted to record. I wanted to record her immigrant daughter's journey from 1920s Detroit to wartime China and back, her search for identity or her place in the world, survival and hope. Or if I get to make a Netflix series, maybe the one-line description will be, a spirited Chinese American woman must claim education and self-reliance against poverty, a pride-bound home life, and disastrous marriage in a quest for survival, identity, and new world dreams. So, to write this, well, it all began in 2002 when my husband took work in New Zealand, which was kind of cool. He got to work on The Lord of the Rings. And while he was there, and I had some time on my hands, I decided to extensively interview my mother, her siblings. Let's see, this is my mom, and these are her siblings, my siblings, and my father. So my father's on the right, and my mom is on the left, and these are my half-siblings. And then when I joined him on my sabbatical in New Zealand, I started blogging one rough draft chapter at a time. And my mom read those early rough draft chapters, and she said, gee, it's nice of you to record my stories. I mean, who else would care? And I said, Mom, these stories are fascinating. This is a slice of history that I want to capture for our family, and I think there's an audience for this. So a little about the title. Although my mother would not have described herself as a Taoist, the title is inspired by a verse from the Tao Te Ching, which I think this audience is probably familiar with, but the Tao Te Ching, I mean, Taoism is a Chinese philosophy based on the writings of Lao Tzu, a 6th century BC philosopher who emphasized living in harmony with the Tao, or the Way, an underlying spiritual force of the universe. Is there anyone here that's a Mandalorian fan? Yeah, every time I hear him say, this is the way, I always think, oh, that's Taoism. Anyway, there's a verse in the Tao Te Ching that says, water is fluid, soft, yielding, but water will wear away rock. What is soft is strong. And that so reminded me of my mother, because she didn't wield sword strength, but she just persisted forever and a day, flowing around or over or seeping through cracks or whatever needed to be done. And that's related to thriving in the margins. In other words, thriving kind of on the edges of society. The story illuminates how life, meaning, and even dignity are built inside spaces that were never really designed for flourishing. Immigrant laundries, racial exclusion, gendered expectations, poverty. Thriving in these circumstances is not about fame or power or ease. It's about adaptation and resilience and gratitude and patience. And so I'll talk about how she was able to find her thriving. So now, history from a woman's perspective. Women's lives are often defined by constraints, cultural, political, and economic. By 7, my mother was standing on a crate in her father's laundry, ironing and folding clothes with her sister, enduring racist taunts on the playground, and and trying to reconcile what passed for normal all around her in Jazz Age America, the Roaring 20s, the era of the Great Gatsby, when women were cutting their hair short and wearing shorter skirts and dancing to jazz music, with her father's vastly different cultural values. And I'll read just a paragraph from the book where she talks about this. This is my mom talking about her father. When he saw American women on the street, half nude in their sport clothes, it seemed indecent. When he saw men and women embrace and kiss openly in public, he thought of it as animal behavior. American wives were unreliable because they sometimes divorced their husbands. There was no such thing as a woman divorcing her husband in China. In every way, as far as Ba was concerned, Chinese women were morally superior to American women. So, would it work better for me to stand on that side?
It was cutting out. I think it'll be okay.
Okay. So here's my mother in, if you can imagine her as a little girl in 1920s Detroit. And her dreams were a real home because she was living in a couple of rooms behind the laundry. This is actually her uncle's laundry. I don't have a photo of her family's laundry, but this was also in Detroit. She wanted to be fashionable like the Jane Austen paper dolls that she was cutting out on Sundays from the newspaper, and she really wanted her very stern father's affection. But when her mother died, when she was 11, her father, to keep the whole family together, decided to bring them all back to his ancestral village in China. 6 kids, 2 still in diapers, back to the village to get a new wife, a new 21-year-old wife. She deserves her own book, I think. And left them there with the new wife while he went back to the United States to start earning money to pay down the debt. He had borrowed money to go back. He'd also borrowed money to pay his wife's medical bills before she died. So he had to go in the middle of the Depression and try to earn the money, pay down all this debt, and then save money to start bringing the family back 1 or 2 at a time over many, many years. This photo is taken when I went to visit the village. The house is still there, but it's no longer lived in, and the neighbors are using it as a chicken coop. So you can see the chickens in there. As you can imagine, they stepped back in progress 100 years. They had been living pretty poorly in the United States, in a couple of rooms behind the laundry, but they had electricity, they had a toilet, they had a telephone, they had access to a doctor when they could pay for one. And in this village, there were none of these things. There were outhouses, there was oil wick candles, there was communication by mail, and there were old wives' tales in place of healthcare. So a couple of years in, my mother got very ill from malaria and malnutrition, a disease of malnutrition called beriberi. And it was touch and go whether or not she was going to be able to survive that, because the superstitious cures that they were providing weren't really helping. On top of all this, in the middle of this, the Sino-Japanese War broke out. And this little illustration was my grandfather's drawing of a Japanese aeroplane, and on the back of a piece of Chinese calendar paper, and I just liked that because it has such a Chinese style in his illustration. So I was really moved by the women of my family. There was my step-grandmother, that's her, who was tricked into marrying my grandfather. The matchmaker told her that he only had 3 kids, and he had 6, and all the kids were hidden away on the wedding day, so she never saw them before she got married. And then my auntie vividly remembers that she came home after the wedding, and she literally held up a finger and started counting and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then she counted again just to be sure. And then to cover her being flustered, she held up in her arms to my baby Uncle James and sort of fussed over him while she just was taking in what her life was going to be now. And then there was my grandmother who died at just 32 years old because despite chronic poor health, she had liver and kidney issues, and her physician told her to stop having children after the 2nd child. She would not give up having children until she had born a son. And tragically, the 1st child was stillborn son, and then she had 5 girls, another stillborn child, and finally the 8th child was a son, and then she died shortly after that. Her dream was to go home to China. She had such a close relationship with her mother. She dreamed of being able to go back to see her mother one more time. And she felt to do that she needed a son, because she felt that her mother-in-law would accuse her of having no face before the villagers if she didn't have a son. And she wanted that, there was a term for it, birth of son happiness. She wanted to be able to place her son in her mother's arms with pride. And sadly, she did not have that experience. And so, as much as I cannot imagine my life without all my aunties, my cousins, their kids, the kids' kids, and the wonderful, huge family at family gatherings, my heart really goes out to my grandmother and the physical and mental anguish that she went through. And then there's my mom, who at 20 was advised by her auntie to find a nest. Even though at that age, she was fully supporting herself. She had a waitress job, and she had a comfortable share rental situation with some friends that she liked. But her auntie was saying, Ying, it is time for you to find a nest, for you to get married, so I will feel like you're comfortable and you're settled. And because my mother loved her auntie, she absorbed this advice into her heart. Those were her words. She said, I absorbed this into my heart. And when the fellow that she was dating, that's Oliver, asked her to marry, she said yes right away. But she didn't realize that he was hiding an addiction from her until after they were married. And then soon her life became really unhappy. Unfortunately, she did not imagine that her life would get any better if she divorced. In her culture, she said, divorce was a disgrace. That was her word. It was a disgrace. It would lead to social isolation and censure, and she felt her life would not be any better. And so she stayed in this unhappy marriage for 16 years. And then finally, when she did get the courage to leave in the early 1960s, everything she feared came to pass. Suddenly her Chinese friends were hurried trying to get her married off again. Oh, Helen, I have a friend, I know, we can fix you up. And her Caucasian coworkers were suddenly not treating her with the same degree of dignity and respect as she had enjoyed when she was married, even though it was a bad marriage. She walked in and she remembered some of she was a waitress, and like the bartender and those guys were kind of joking with each other and saying, I bet she's hot to trot now, huh? And she was just mortified. You know, she said, I always wanted to be a lady, and here they were talking about me this way. And it really sent her into a depression for a while. And so when I was a girl, it was my mom's cinematic stories that really stuck with me, like trying to get out of China during the Sino-Japanese War with the zero planes flying overhead and hiding in the bushes and things like that. But as an adult, these stories about the status and history of women really touched my heart. The good news is that despite everything that she feared, happening, at the end of the day, she was still standing, and her life did start to improve. I was so thrilled when I came to the museum and I found the diorama of the laundry, because I don't have a picture of my grandfather's laundry business, so I was glad to see this depiction of what it might have looked like. Women's stories reveal their invisible labor, the work that sustains life, but rarely enters the historical record. My grandmother, who had come from a fairly well-to-do family in China, became a laborer in the United States in my grandfather's laundry business. She did sewing and ironing. Of course, she also did the cooking and helping with cleaning and caring for the children. And she was the family's emotional base until her own mental health started to break. Mental health in this story exists without diagnosis, therapy, or vocabulary, because it wasn't really understood in the way that we understand mental health nowadays. My grandmother's physical ailments, her heart, liver, and kidney problems intertwined with her homesickness, her grief, her chronic disappointment. And she experienced what today might be called a dissociative identity disorder, which is taking on a different personality temporarily. And my grandfather responded, and here I'm going to quote from the book, by drawing pictures of a frightening man with chubby cheeks and chubby arms, crouching bare-chested, bearing a knife menacingly on sheets of red paper. And these he hung over the doors to try to scare away the ghost that he believed had possessed my grandmother. He thought that this other personality was another being or a ghost. Now, I have a question for you all, because it never occurred to me to ask whether this chubby man was a specific character or being until this week, when I was reading in the San Francisco Chronicle about the UCSF East Asian Medical Archive, where they had this over 200-year-old Japanese woodblock print. And the description was that they would put this image of a folk hero called Kintaro, which is this boy that was very kind of chubby and muscular, bearing an axe, over the door to let people know that someone was sick within, and also to protect the inhabitants from the illness. And I thought, oh, that's like what my grandfather did. And I was just curious if anyone had heard of this type of story in their own family of someone who would put drawings up of, I don't know, I thought maybe it might be a Taoist entity or a Taoist god or being or something like that, but I don't see any hands raised, so I guess not. So that didn't work. That didn't heal my grandmother. So I thought this was so interesting what my grandfather did next. he consulted elders in Chinatown and asked their advice. And their advice was, they said, this is a spiritual matter. You should take her to a place of spiritual healing. And they advised her to go to the United Methodist Church in Detroit. And my mom said that for the first time in her recollection, my grandfather spent money a little bit frivolously. He let my grandmother go to the salon, get her hair styled, get a new dress, get a hat, and she got to buy hats for all of the children, and they got out of the laundry, and they went on the streetcar, and they went to this beautiful church with the high ceilings and the stained glass and the choral music, and the preacher, and the community being very welcoming to them, and the preacher preaching words of acceptance and forgiveness. And over time, my grandmother was very moved by this, and by this experience. My mom said it was a tonic to all of them to get out of the laundry where they lived and worked, and to go someplace and to dress up and to feel special for, you know, one day a week. And over time, it helped. It helped my grandmother. It didn't happen instantaneously, but her symptoms started to subside. And so my grandmother's healing, her thriving, came not through medicine, and certainly not through any psychological help, but through community and beauty and music and ritual and words of acceptance and words of forgiveness. And I thought that was very, very beautiful. And then there's my mom. The Chinese laundry, kind of a classic marginal space, is where she learned at a very young age to run errands, serve customers, handle money, and practice language skills. And she developed some self-confidence from that. She learned to be useful. By 17, she was on her own. And much of the book is about how she navigates mid-century California as a young, inexperienced minority woman and what that was like, both physically and spiritually. She began as a live-in domestic worker, and you get to read about the rather shabby way that people treat the lowest person on the rung of their house in the privacy of their home, and how hard it was to find a place to live in a decent part of town when landlords don't want to rent to people of your race, and doors literally slam in your face. Sorry. And she experienced segregated work. This is my mom in the red circle. And these are all the Asian American waitresses of Plan's Restaurant, which was on MacArthur and Broadway in Oakland. And that was a huge dining facility. Now it's Kaiser Permanente in Oakland. And after that, it was MacArthur Broadway Shopping Center, which I remember like in the 60s and 70s. But before that, in the 50s and earlier, it was this huge dining area. It was a fine dining restaurant, it was a coffee shop, it was a cocktail lounge, huge parking lot. The Caucasian waitresses were all in the dining area and the coffee shop. The Asian American waitresses were all in the cocktail lounge. They were sort of an exotic attraction in the cocktail lounge. You might think, oh, that's not as good of a place to work as the dining room because people spend more in the dining room. But they had kind of the last laugh because my mom said that the cocktail lounge got to be so popular that they started serving dinner in there as well. People liked to go in and have dinner in the cocktail lounge. Her theory, her speculation was, she said, oh, there was no dating between the races at that time. So Caucasian wives liked to dine in there where there wasn't the cute Caucasian waitresses. and they felt like, you know, they were safe with their husbands. So thriving here is internal. I feel like I skipped something here. So thriving looks like not freedom come from constraint, but the ability to live meaningfully in it. When my mom was little, her dad didn't bother sending her to school. In the village where he lived, school cost money. Poor rural families didn't always send their girls, and so he thought, oh, she's just gonna grow up to be a housewife, she doesn't need to be educated. Thankfully, for her and my aunties, a police officer came by and noticed that they were playing out front on a school day and said, you have to send your girls to school by law. And he said, well, I don't have the money for it. And he said, it's paid for with our taxes. And so at 7 years old, my mom got to go to school for the first time. And although school at first maybe deepened her sense of exclusion, because she was the Chinese kid in the class of white kids, learning started to expand her world. She said it literally felt like the world was getting bigger because she started to understand the conversations happening around her. She could read the signs on the street and in the shops. She could read books, and it offered dignity. She could share the games and the songs that she learned at school with her sisters at home. It provided also, her imagination provided status where her means did not. There's a charming story where she didn't get to participate in a school recital. She was really disappointed about that because her dad couldn't pay for the costume fee or something like that. But she really liked getting to practice the dances and the singing and the dancing and watching the show. And when she went back to her school in China, she spearheaded the school talent show there. She suggested to her village teacher, she said, we could do a talent show, like we did in the US. And the teacher said, okay, yes, let's do it. And so she was able to create this nice event for her community. And then there's my grandmother. The story goes that when my Auntie Jeannie was born, it was in the middle of the Great Depression. And they were really struggling financially, and my grandmother was very ill. And my grandfather said, we should just put her under a blanket and let her suffocate. And when I first heard that, I was so shocked because I couldn't imagine. But I came to find out that infanticide has this long history, not just in Chinese culture, but in many cultures during periods of famine. And my grandfather was born in the 19th century, and I realized that he was repeating the survival wisdom of his ancestors. And my mild grandmother, she stood up and she said, no, Osin, go with life. Go with life. And it was a quiet statement, but a profound one that made an impression on my grandfather, who was dissuaded from his desperate impulse, and also on my mom. Go with life means continuing even when the path is unclear, accepting what your reality without surrendering to it, and adapting without losing yourself. Later in life, one of the ways that my mother adapted was through wise money management as a tool of feminine strength. She wanted to have some control over her life, and so the first thing that she did was she finally made her own separate savings account from her husband so that she could start preserving some of her own earnings separate from him. And then she learned about investing, and she started investing in mutual funds. And then she eventually bought a fixer-upper house. And then she went down to the hardware store and just asked, well, how do you fix things? How do you paint? How do you refinish a floor? How do you patch a hole? And that's what she was doing with her free time. She started fixing up this house. By the time she met my father in 1962, she owned 2 houses. The one she lived in plus one she rented out. which even nowadays, for a blue-collar, single minority woman, is quite an accomplishment. In 1962, it was amazing because she had such a hard time even getting a loan, and when she found a bank willing to loan to her, they insisted on a 28% down payment. So it was quite a thing. They met because my dad was a customer at her restaurant. He was an Oklahoma farm boy who had just come out to California. He was a teacher on the GI Bill after serving in the World War II. And he said the first time he saw her, he thought she was stunning, but she looked so different from the girls that he had grown up with that he wasn't sure he could get used to her. That feeling passed, thank goodness, or I wouldn't be here. And honestly, I never said this to him, but when I look back, I feel like socially conservative Southern culture, which is what my dad grew up with, and traditional Chinese culture have more in common than you might imagine. They both did not believe in sex before marriage. They met in December, engaged in February, married in March, and they stayed married for over 50 years until my mom passed away. And I think you can't do that unless you're mostly on the same page. They certainly had cultural differences, but that's not what defined their relationship. And so there was this gradual transformation, both externally and internally. But it was real, and this is my mom in the 90s getting to travel around the world finally on her own terms. And at this point, how are we doing on time?
Maybe about like 10-ish, 15 minutes.
Oh, perfect, because I'm sort of done talking about the book, but I just thought I would share that because of my mother's stories, I so wanted to go visit her village that featured in so many of her most amazing stories. And she never wanted to go back. It was a place of such dark memories for her. She didn't want to see it, and I thought, maybe I'll never get to see it, because I didn't want to just go back by myself. I wanted to go back with a family member. And then in 2024, I saw that Viking Cruises was offering a new cruise from Shanghai to Hong Kong. And at about the same time, I learned that my Auntie Jeannie, 97 years old, was still traveling around the world with her daughter on cruises. And I said, Auntie Jeannie, you want to go on a cruise with me to China, and I'll figure out a way to get us from Hong Kong to the village. And she said, yeah, let's do that. And so I reached out to my China roots. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. Yeah, I see some heads nodding. My China Roots is this wonderful organization in China that serves the global diaspora. They offer ancestry research, but they also offer customized tours for members of the diaspora to go and visit their places of ancestral interest. So, So they created a custom itinerary to pick my family up from the cruise ship in Hong Kong, and we took an overnight trip to visit Taipingpong. I am embarrassed to say Chinese words because I know I don't say them correctly. In Mandarin, it's written like Dashin Bang. So.
Where is it?
In the Guangdong province near Kaiping. Yeah. Oh, so on the final morning of the cruise, our guide was named Zhang, but he invited us to call him Michael. He picked us up, and we arrived on the outskirts of the village, and I had no idea what to expect. This is my auntie. She turned 98 years old on the cruise. She had not been there in 80 years. She left when she was 18 years old. Just off to the side of this photo was the building that she remembered being the school building, but now it's an administrative building. So we walked in, and this gentleman here driving in on a moped, and he stopped, and I suppose he asked, who are you? What are you doing here? What are you looking for? And Michael explained, oh, this lady lived here in this village when she was a little girl, and her family wanted to see this place. And my auntie held out our family tree to show him. And something for me it was just magical, because he looked at the family tree and he pointed to his father on our family tree. And I couldn't believe it. And again, I did not know whether this place would be completely transformed. Oh, there's the family tree. It was exactly as my auntie remembered it and my mother described it, other than a slight modernization. The dirt paths were paved. There was now a fence around the fishing pond. The clay homes were now covered in brick, and the little well that my mom described had a little safety rim around it. But everything was in its place, just as they remembered it and as my mother described it. This altar looked exactly the way my mom described it. It was exactly where I expected it to be. This banyan tree, it wasn't the one that my mom and auntie grew up with, but it was in the same location. They told her that they had planted a new tree. And it was just amazing to me. And the well was still being used. It was almost cinematic. We walked by and this woman was pulling out water to wash her vegetables. And they knew who my auntie was. They said, oh, one of the American girls. They still knew this story about my mom and my aunties having come from the United States to the village. So it just blew my mind. And my auntie said, oh, it was the fourth row and the fourth house. And there it was. The house was still there. And so this was the first edition of the book. That's what I'm holding. The rice paddies were still there. They had worked in rice paddies when they were there. This was September, so they were drained. Those hills in the distance behind the rice paddies, my auntie said, that's where we fled to when the Japanese came through to pillage the village, and we hid in there for a while. So it was like these stories that my mom had been telling since I was a little girl came to life for me. And the other really touching thing was that the neighbors were still maintaining our family's altar inside the house. So we went in, there was still the family altar. They had been still offering burnt offerings on special occasions, and they invited my auntie to give a burnt offering at the family's altar, still inside the house. And two other places that they took us to, again, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but Chikan, a riverport town that was nearby. It's now this gorgeous resort, but the guide said that our family might have started their water journey here because the Tan River flows through. It leads to the Pearl River, which my mom and aunties remembered going down the Pearl River towards Hong Kong. And now it's a resort. It's like an undiscovered Venice. It's so lovely there. They also took us to Detroit, where the Ying ancestral hall was. And I love technology because I could take my phone and we could hold it up to the pictures of all the inscriptions, and the Google Translate would tell me what it was saying in English, and I could read what had been written about this distant ancestor. So I will finish by just reading the opening of the book, the prologue. In my heyday, I was a bit over 5 feet tall. Today, I am 4 feet 8 inches. I am a little person, but I have lived a big life. China, the country of my heritage, traded silk for gold with Rome and Carthage. And millennia after the Roman Empire and Carthage fell, China still endures. I like to think of myself that way. I did not have
much formal education or encouragement as I was growing up. Some believe my ways are a little backward, but I have persisted. During my life, I have been criticized as sometimes too boisterous, too quiet, sometimes not smart enough, or sometimes not big enough. As long as I try my best, I know I have value and am deserving. The most important thing I have looked for is an appreciation for who I am, which is hard to find in the world. Cultural and educational barriers are difficult to overcome. Those we love most are sometimes our greatest detractors. However, where once I shared 2 rooms with 8 family members, now I live in a hilltop home with a view of San Francisco. Where once I did not have the opportunity to finish high school, now both my daughters have college degrees. Where once I was alone and lonely, now I have family and friends. This is my story. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. I really appreciate your presentation and your talk today. Right now, we're actually going to transition into the Q&A session for about 15-20 minutes. I'm going to give the mic back to Karin if you want to start, you can. But we're going to have a mic runner, and I imagine we have an audience question. Anyone have one ready?
What was the surname? Your mother.
Ying. Yeah. Although it was interesting when we went to the ancestral hall and like Google translated it as you. So I guess
That's the man.
Mandarin, yeah. Yeah.
Another question?
I'm curious, how much were you able to learn about your family's history when you went back to the village? What were some other experiences you had there?
Well, I don't know if it was so much about my immediate family's history, but I learned about this original ancestor, which I never knew about. And I can't remember what century he was, but medieval ages, something like that. So that was fascinating. And I loved the very poetic way he was written about when I was reading the Google Translate lines. And I'm sorry, I don't recall, he was an official, and they recounted all of his accomplishments, and but yeah, that's mostly what I learned about. The things that were in the village, I mean, I had known about, as I said, my mom and aunties described it, and then to find it all still there in place was amazing to me.
So can you describe a little bit the process of writing the book? What some of the key problems, getting?
So I was mentioning to him a little before the talk that my publication process was so circuitous because I didn't come from any sort of literature or publishing background. Around the time that I was, first of all, I wrote it, and then someone told me, another author said, you would want to take it to a developmental editor. A developmental editor is someone who looks at the big picture of your story. They're not looking at just grammar and things like that, but does the story work? And so she helped me whittle it down. It was so much longer, and she also helped me fix a point of view problem, because I had all these stories also from my aunties, and so it was changing point of view, and she said, just make it from your mother's perspective, and then she can tell your auntie's stories as well. So when I was finally ready to try to get it published, I heard from somebody that there were these Twitter pitching events. And Twitter pitching events are, you pick an event that's in your genre, and then on that day you can put 3 tweets between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. You have 180 characters or 240 characters, whatever it is, to pitch your book. And if you get a heart on your tweet from a publisher or an agent, that means they're asking for a more detailed pitch. So I did my 3 tweets. I got 2 hearts from small press publishers, and I submitted my query to both. They both offered. I almost got published with one, and then just before it was about to get published, they went out of business during the pandemic. So then I had to start all over again through the real query process, like most authors do. There was 42 queries that I sent out, and could have sent more, but 42 got me the first publisher based in London, and they were a publisher of diaspora stories. I thought London would be okay because the world is online, but it turned out to not be the best experience because all of their work and marketing and everything was in Europe, and I couldn't participate. I couldn't go to book festival. I couldn't do anything there, and I didn't know enough to pitch myself around here. So it was almost coincidental. Around this time, I became aware of an author named Julia Park Tracy. She does historical fiction, and I really liked her work, and I started following her on social media. She's a local author, and I happened to be talking to my boss at the Alameda Post, and I said, you know, I wish I had got published with someone like what Julia Park Tracy got published with, because she's doing everything I want to do, you know, she's going to festivals and doing book talks, and he said, well, why don't you just write to her and ask, and you know, and it's funny how a little bit of encouragement can be so meaningful, because I'm not sure I would have done that, but I wrote to her and she said, oh sure, you know, submit your work through the Sibylline Press portal and we'll look at it. And she looked at it, and I should say the good thing, what gave me confidence was that in the meantime, I got a good Kirkus review, and Kirkus Reviews picked it as a top 100 indie book. And so I pitched that, and she said, yes, we would like to republish this. And so this is published by Sibylline Press, and it's been just a night and day experience because they represent a lot of California authors, and so we can get on panels together and go to events. And a lot of these ladies have Masters of Fine Arts. They kind of know the business better, so I can pick their brain, and it's just, so that was a very long-winded answer. Sorry to your question. Yeah.
The one thing that I kind of missed out on is the time frame and the time would be in chronologically speaking. When was your mother in China? And how long was she there?
1935 to 1939. So she was there for 4 years before she was able to come back, and she was the first one to come back. It took so long for my grandfather to get the whole family.
So when she was back in China, how old was she?
She arrived when she was 12 and left when she was 16. And and she just stayed with a couple of aunts when she first got here. And then they had their own families and things. And finally, the auntie said, you know, we need to get you out on your own. And so that's when she became a domestic worker in someone else's family. Yeah.
We have another question?
Yeah, I'm curious. Your story is wonderful. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for coming here. Did you hear anything through your mom or your grandparents about when they went to China and being there and reminiscing about time they spent here and wanting to come back, missing it, torn, conflicted? Did you hear any of those stories? I mean,
My grandfather's heart, I think, was always in China in a ways. I mean, my mom said he was always following Chinese news. He read the Chinese newspaper. He was for Chiang Kai-shek. He was like, oh, those Reds, but my mom was American, and her experience in that village during wartime and through, almost dying of malnutrition was so bad that she did not have that same kind of sentimentality about it. But yeah, I think my grandfather's heart was always kind of back there. Yeah. Yes.
How do you relate to your father's side of the family story?
You know, to be mixed race, I consider a blessing. To be able to walk with ease in more than one culture is lovely. I feel, and I say that because both sides of my family are very loving. I mean, maybe if, you know, it hadn't been that way, I might not feel that way. But I felt as much at home here in Chinatown, where I came every week to visit my grandparents, as I did out in the plains of Oklahoma, in my dad's farm where he grew up, and the people are so friendly back there, and like, how y'all doing, and all of that. I loved that experience as a child because I grew up in a very urban environment, and to go back there and see the Milky Way at night and all of that. And they were just very accepting. I mean, I will say they got married in 1963 before interracial marriage was legal throughout the United States. It was legal here in California. So there was concern on both sides, and in fact, it was kind of funny because the concern was more on my Chinese family side than on my dad's side. My grandfather said, oh, you know, these Caucasians, they take you up and use you, and you're used and discard you when they get older and all this. And my mom said, you know, Dad, I don't think he's like that. My aunties, though, they were all very welcoming. They're like, oh, yeah, you know, they were just glad that my mom had found someone to love and care for. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were surprised at how domestic workers were treated by families that they lived with.
Not surprised, but, you know.
Well, yeah, and so I was kind of curious, you didn't elaborate on like the experience your mom had with that first job, because I've known friends that lived in some of the older luxury buildings here in San Francisco where the Chinese workers lived, you know, did the laundry in the little rooms they lived in downstairs in the basement with no windows. And so I just, in terms, what was the experience that your mother had as a domestic, was she?
Well, the first family she worked for was actually in the Sunset District on Ortega Avenue. And she was so innocent, and it turned out that the wife was kind of a swinger. You know, the husband would go away on business trips, and then suddenly she would have people over, and you know, at first she said they would have these kind of wild cocktail parties, and she was supposed to take care of the baby in the back room or something while this was happening, and then the next morning she would wake up and see a couple of them in bed, and she goes, oh, they must have just got so drunk they passed out or something like that. And, I mean, she just didn't know, and it was just a real cultural shock, you know, for her. And then from there she worked for a family in Berkeley, and they had it was an Asian family, and she liked the parents, but they had 5 kids, and she was just, you know, 17 and a little tiny person, and trying to corral all these kids, and she said at the end of the day, she would practically be in tears because she felt like, you know, she's depending on this for her living and her livelihood, but she couldn't keep control of these kids for the parents. And finally, from there, when the father lost his job, the mother helped her find her first waitressing job at a restaurant in Berkeley. She said it was like 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and all of that. But she worked her way up. She ended up working at the Fairmont Hotel Tonga Room here in San Francisco, and other fine dining establishments, and that she was able to get a middle class living that way. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process that you went through to writing the book, who you were able to interview, how much you were able to interview your mother or your grandfather or these people, or?
Sadly, I did not get to interview my grandfather because he had already passed by the time I started this process in 2002. But I am so grateful that all my aunts and my mother were very generous with their stories, and I don't think I realized what a blessing that was, because sometimes when I've talked about this book, and some people have said, you know, you're lucky that your family was willing to talk to you about these really hard stories. And in fact, my in-laws lived through Nazi-occupied Denmark, and they never wanted And I understand not wanting to go back to these dark memories, but now those stories are lost forever. You know, we'll never hear what that experience was like. And all my aunties were so, oh, Kimmy's writing a book, of course we want to, you know, they were all gung-ho and willing to share as many stories as I would ask about. And I only wish I could have thought to ask more questions, like, who was this man that my grandfather was drawing when my grandmother was ill? Yeah, they were generous in their stories.
We maybe have time for one or two more questions. If anyone has more questions.
What's your, I know you mentioned Park Tracy. Do you have other artists that you look up to, any authors or writers?
Oh, well, Lisa C., and of course Amy Tan, you know. I actually just love a lot of classic authors as well, just, you know, Dickens and Thomas Hardy, and those were the authors I fell in love with when I was in college, and I was like, oh, I want to write stories. But, oh, I'm sorry, those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story. I thought I had written my memoirs. I've written a few, and now you're giving me some basis for ideas to enhance it.
Oh.
And you know, it's very interesting. Your talk here sits between, you know, our upcoming holiday and Mother's Day. And you know, I think about my mom in her life and how she was living on the margins in some ways, but she was resilient, and that's, I think, really the basis of your story here, and the point I think you really stretched or brought across to me personally. So I want to thank you for that.
Oh,
the other thing was you had this symbol with the caricature of the Japanese person, sort of like divine protection or scare the spirits. Well, last year I was in China. They do have these like couplet style on each side of the doors. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yes, I do.
And even in the temples where they have these gods that sort of protect the premises.
Yeah.
So that gave me the idea of that. So and you asked, well, is there any experience for anybody in the audience about Taoist belief or anything like that? And that's what came to mind.
Yeah, that's what after I saw the Japanese figure, I thought, oh, I bet he was drawing someone specific, like a Taoist deity or something like that.
The very last thing was, my grandmother went through the Medicine Act, you know, in 1943. They actually came here in 1947. You could become naturalized as a Chinese American, but 105 per year until 1965. And I count that as a miracle. It's in my memoir about how I report that out, and it's just God's grace, basically, is what it is for them. A family of 4 coming over here out of 105 for that year.
Wow.
So that's just truly amazing for me.
The way that my family came was that my great-grandfather purchased a citizenship document from someone who was returning to the village to settle. So they had the same last name of Ying, and then through that, my grandfather was considered a citizen's son, and my grandmother was considered a citizen's wife.
Oh.
And so that's, you know, so yeah, paper grandfather. Yeah.
We all got here one way or another. That's what I'm told from
Yeah.
family members who went that route. Exactly. Yeah.
Great. Any last final questions for Karin today?
Thank you so much.
Now, some closing remarks. Also just want to, again, thank you, Karin, for coming today. I also want to take some time to wrap up some things. Also, just thank you for our volunteers that have come today to help support the event. Just want to give them a little bit of applause for coming as well. So, upcoming events. We do have one event coming on June 6th. It's titled The Moys of New York and Shanghai, and the author is called Charlotte Brooks. I think there's more information at the registration table. You can find it more online as well. As you can see, we are a nonprofit and we are run a lot by volunteers. So if you are interested in volunteering or helping out in general, feel free to express interest in that and stay in touch. We do have a newsletter QR code, I think, at the registration table. It will lead you to, I believe, the website, and then if you scroll all the way down, there will be a newsletter link to sign up. Feel free to give us a follow. And yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for everyone coming today. And also I just want to transition us into lunch.